Greetings. This is the one you've known as Jesus the Christ. I'd like to speak more in depth about one of the qualities of the divine self of presence that's often overlooked: clarity. You all know what clarity is because everyone experiences it from time to time. Clarity has a sharpness and definiteness about it. Even the word itself is crisp and pointed. When you hear this word, you may think of the brightness of a diamond or the clear blue sky on a fall day. With clarity, everything is in focus, tuned in, obvious, and seen clearly. Clarity is the absence of cloudiness, unclear boundaries, muddiness, confusion, doubt, and fear. If something is unclear, it's not being seen clearly or at all. If something is clear, it's being seen, known. That's clarity. Clarity is the state of perfect knowingness, of surety. You're confident in your knowingness and need not question it or doubt it. You may think there's nothing more to say about clarity but to define it as I just did. But there's quite a bit more to say, because experiencing clarity is one thing, and achieving it is quite another. How does one achieve clarity? Is there anything you can do to attain clarity? Most of the time, clarity arises suddenly and from out of the blue. Suddenly you have clarity about something you were formerly unclear about. How did that happen? Did you or can you do anything to cause it? While you can't determine when clarity will arise, you can prepare the ground for it. You do this by not doing whatever might interfere with clarity and by making space for it. What causes a lack of clarity, what muddies the waters, is always thought. You might think that you can think your way to clarity, but most thoughts only confuse and muddy the waters. This is a good metaphor because water gets muddied by stirring up the dirt that's settled to the bottom, while it becomes clear by not stirring up the water, through stillness. And so it is with clarity. Clarity is supported by stillness, by a quiet mind, and interfered with by thoughts. Solutions to your so-called problems are always being given to you in their own time, but you have to be attentive to them, and that requires a quiet mind. Clarity requires silence. Clarity arises in the silence when you've stopped thinking about the problem. Stillness requires a stillness of both the body and the mind, for it's difficult to have one without the other. The mind is stilled by quieting the body, and the body becomes even more still and relaxed once the mind quiets down. Both are usually necessary for stillness, and stillness is necessary for clarity. It turns out that sitting and just being is actually doing something very important. It's how you make room for clarity and guidance about what to do. I'm not suggesting you have to be still all the time to achieve clarity. I'm only suggesting you make some space in your life regularly to be quiet and still, so that clarity, when it arises, will be noticed. Clarity can arise in the midst of a busy life, but will you notice it enough to honor it? Or will you brush it off and not allow it to have an impact on your consciousness and on your life? Clarity, like all qualities of your divine nature, is subtle, unlike thoughts, which can be quite loud and demanding, and the egoic mind, the voice in your head, readily dismisses and discounts such subtle communications. The egoic mind, after all, wants you to pay attention to it, not let your life be guided by such clarity. That aspect of the mind which is driven by the ego doesn't want you to still the mind, because that would mean you weren't listening to it. When the mind is trying to solve a problem, the last thing it does is be still. The mind latches onto what it thinks of as a problem and then tries to fix that problem by actively thinking about how to solve it. Some thinking is useful, of course, but the best solutions don't come from thinking. Rather, they arise suddenly out of nowhere in their own time, and listening to the voice in your head only interferes with this process. The mind can settle on a solution and go about implementing it, but that solution might not be the solution to the problem, the one that life has for you. Life always offers you a solution if you're patient enough to wait for it and allow it to arise in its own time. But for you to catch this solution when it arises, you have to be available to notice it. And you won't be available if you're constantly thinking. This is tricky because some rational thought is necessary to solve a problem. The rational mind can be useful in identifying something as a problem and for identifying some possible solutions. However, so many of your problems are not real problems at all, but made up by the voice in your head and don't really need solving. So to try to solve them would be a waste of your time and energy, although many people do spend their time and energy this way. For instance, the voice in your head sees aging as a problem, while aging is simply a natural part of life. The voice in your head will spend a lot of time grappling with this issue, which it can do little about. It fusses and examines and is worried and concerned about this very natural process that it has little control over. Lots of unnecessary time and energy is wasted trying to solve this problem that can't be solved, because aging is not actually a problem, but something that simply needs to be accepted. However, the egoic mind is not in the business of acceptance, but the business of creating problems and trying to solve those problems. There are lots of other examples of this. Even having to move, for example, is not really a problem the voice in your head can solve. You'll use the rational mind at various stages in the process of moving, but the need to move and where and when to move come out of the flow. All of a sudden you realize you need to move, and that will be followed by life showing you where and when in its own time. Clarity will arise about where and when as it's needed, and the voice in your head only gets in the way of this process. The rational mind is useful in reserving a moving van or arranging for movers or in organizing your belongings for the move, but the where and when of it is not a problem the egoic mind can solve or should try to solve, because needing to move is not actually a problem, but just a natural movement of life that's showing up and unfolding in its own time. However, I must add that if it's your ego that wants to move, then the answers to where and when will also likely come from the ego. But if a move is in the cards, in your divine plan, where and when will come out of the flow. Notice how the voice in your head labels things as problems that aren't problems, but things that just come out of the flow to be done. Going to the doctor, for instance, seems like a problem to the ego because it doesn't like going to the doctor. Anything the ego doesn't like to do falls into the category of a problem for it, and it fusses and worries and strategizes to solve this problem. Meanwhile, you just pick up your phone and make an appointment, and when the time comes to go to the doctor, you get in your car and go, and when you're at the doctor's appointment, you do what they ask you to do, and then you go home. To the ego, life happening feels like a problem, but it's just life happening. Going to the doctor happens, flat tires happen, mistakes happen, things get broken, people get mad, people grow old, people die, things happen, but none of these things happening is a problem until you define it as one. If you didn't think of something as a problem, it wouldn't feel like one. Those feelings are what make life feel bad, not the so-called problem. Your lack of clarity creates unpleasant feelings, and that makes life unpleasant. Even this isn't a problem. It's just what happens when you lack clarity, and the suffering that results from this lack of clarity is life's way of pointing you to another way of seeing things. Clarity is seeing the truth about life and not being bamboozled by the voice in your head. The voice in your head hijacks you and takes you into its unhappy reality, where life feels heavy and the littlest things can feel burdensome. The voice in your head makes you feel like a victim, or it drives you to exhaustion trying to be perfect or trying to fix some imagined problem. Life doesn't have to be that way. It's only that way because the ego sees life that way. And when you're identified with the ego, you see life the way the ego sees it. Clarity is seeing life as the divine self sees it. It's seeing life as it truly is, which is miraculous, beautiful, and ever-changing. Clarity is seeing that you are just along for the ride as the river of life takes you where it's taking you. Clarity is seeing that you're floating down a river that has a destiny and purpose of its own in which you play a part, and this destiny naturally has twists and turns which you're not in control of. Clarity is seeing that you're being taken on a ride by life, and that you can either cooperate with life or fight the experiences life's bringing you. Yes, you have some power to choose, and most importantly, you have the power to choose your attitude toward life's adventure. But mostly, life is in control, and it's taking you somewhere, and where it's taking you is good. Clarity is seeing this. The ego does not see this. It thinks it's making its own way in life and can and should be able to make life go its way. This is insanity, not clarity. It's insanity because it's a false perception. And when you believe something that isn't true about life, you'll suffer. And so the ego suffers. But you don't have to. When you see with clarity, you realize that you are not separate from life, but part of the beautiful and perfect unfolding of life. Thank you for being part of this beautiful unfolding. I am with you always.